Personal stories, especially our own stories, are crucial as to how we see the world and how the world perceives us. I was a triplet through IVF, and the doctor said he could see it. My mum's stomach hung lower than it had the last time he had seen her. So after doing a couple of tests and exams, he unfortunately concluded that he was right. My 2 brothers had died, and I was born 3 months premature, weighing barely a kilo, and they said I probably wouldn't survive. The first thing I recall from my childhood, the first thing I can remember, is my dad taking me to this aquarium back when we used to live in Denmark. And it used to be one of my favorite things to do because I thought all the fish looked really funny. I only ever remember my dad as this strong and happy individual. And then the second thing I recall is him, sick and pale in a hospital bed. And I'm at the end of this hospital bed on the floor with my aunt playing with dolls, while my mum sat on the side of the bed holding his hand and just silently crying as he died from a very severe type of cancer that he had only been diagnosed with 6 months prior. And as I compare those 2 images in my head, I realized that no child expects to lose a parent. So I went to grief therapy for around a year with other children around the ages of 4 to 8. I was 4 at the time. And as we were all trying to collectively scoop water out of our little boats, I heard some of the most horrifying stories of parents who had died from illness, or from suicide, and even one girl's dad who had actually murdered her mum. And as it turns out, that's where a lot of my fears in life stem from. I am indescribably terrified of kayaks, and I refuse to ever sail one because the reason one of these children were there was that her dad had been out sailing his kayak, and then the boat had flipped, and he'd been stuck in the boat. So he couldn't turn back around, and he had drowned and died. And essentially, all these children were affected by the deaths of their parents, of course, myself included, which got me treated with almost like velvet gloves growing up in the Danish educational system, which of course had its benefits, but it also had its drawbacks. It stabilized me emotionally, which was definitely something I needed. I just lost a parent, and that's a huge grief. But it also hindered me in the way that it got me prematurely labeled as this sensitive person, which seemed to just precede anything I would do, and was a way too big label that hung over me for way too long. And just like I was labeled, we continue to label people left and right, and labels affect our perception of what we can and cannot do in life. I remember the death of my father and my brothers and just my whole past that people would describe as taxing and tragic, and that perhaps made all my teachers treat me so gently that they never pushed me to do something I wasn't comfortable with. So I stayed in my comfort zone growing up. I refused to join the Scouts because I was terrified of talking in front of people. But then I remember my elementary school teacher one day coming up to me and saying that I should just take it easy, just one day at a time, and that I should try to collect the days, and hopefully collect more good days than bad days. And to me, these good days were the days where I could just be quiet and not noticed and not stick out and not do something I wasn't comfortable with. So that's what I did. However, I think that if we're to break down the stereotypes surrounding these labels, we need the people who have actually experienced being labeled to step forward and to speak up and tell the stories of how they felt affected by the labels to make the general public reevaluate just how quickly we labeled them. So in grade 9, I decided to do something I wasn't comfortable with. For my personal project, I decided to be a risk taker and write an entire novel. And I've been writing stories since I was around 10, but never something of this length and never in this short of a time frame. But along with writing, I really loved reading, and I'd been reading books about all these characters who were somehow stuck under these labels, and I felt like I related to them. So after doing a lot of research, I decided to write a book called The Higher Plane, which details the lives of a group of minority individuals as they come together and tell their stories in order to rise up against society. One person in particular who experienced being labeled is Katrina. And Katrina is a politician in the European Parliament and an ethnic minority in Europe. At the 2019 elections for the European Parliament, ethnic minorities took 24 out of 705 seats. That amounts to them taking just around 5% of the seats. However, this is greatly disproportional when you think about the fact that ethnic minorities make up around 10% of the European population, which means they should have 48 seats. But despite this astounding achievement, she often feels taunted or ignored, and her opinions are overlooked all the time in favor of the opinions of the white members of European Parliament. And she's told that she was lucky and that it was a moment of luck. And as people so nicely put it, lack of other suitable candidate that got her elected to European Parliament. But despite the fact that she actually has a very rightful place here, not only as a representative for her party, but as a representative for the ethnic minorities of Europe, she often feels belittled. She experiences having to be very organized and very punctual, which in itself, that's not a big ask, but if she's not, her opinions aren't respected or listened to. But say a white member of European Parliament is somewhat late or a little disorganized, their opinions are still respected. But if she's somewhat late or a little bit disorganized, she's just another one of those immigrants. And this just goes to show how relevant racism still is in a union that claims to be united by diversity. But what if I told you that Katrina isn't actually a real person, and that she doesn't actually exist in the real world? She exists as a figment of my imagination and as a character of my storytelling. However, she's still valuable because she represents my research. And more importantly, she represents the people like her, such as the black Swedish politician Alice Bah Kuhnke, who she's based partly on. So she's still relevant because she represents all these people who share one or several of her attributes. And you must have heard the phrase, "Oh, I wish I could have seen myself represented in the media when I was growing up." And that phrase right there is exactly why storytelling is so valuable. That when we ensure diversity in media in all its forms, in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, religion, gender identity, or sexuality, we are promoting inclusivity. And in its essence, media is all about conveying a message. So when we are ensuring this diversity, we are by default conveying a message of inclusivity and tolerance in order to break down these labels. And when we on top of that not only represent them, but actually tell their stories, we're hoping to invoke empathy in people, which is the quickest way to changing society's hearts and thus their minds. And this makes storytelling such a valuable asset in this fight for equality, as well as to spread hope. Now, it's very important to remember that personal stories, preferably told by the person themselves, are arguably a lot more important than just telling any story. That despite all the research I've done and all the people I've talked to who share one or several of Katrina's attributes, I am not a female politician of color in the European Union, and that's okay. That despite, through this book, I try to convey some of what that's like, I will never be able to tell that story as well as somebody who's actually lived it. which is why we need these minority individuals to come forward and to tell their stories of how they felt pushed aside because of their labels or hindered by their minority status, even though they may be completely capable individuals. But unfortunately, it's very common thought to think that in order to be able to share your stories and make an actual impact, you have to have a platform. And that platform could be a book or a movie or music or even just a flourishing social media account. But when I went to grief therapy, we would sit down around a table and we would just share stories and we would talk. And in retrospect, I think that's what made me realize just how lucky I am to be alive. That despite the fact that the doctor said that I probably wouldn't make it, I did. I survived. And to me, that gives me almost an obligation to try to better the lives of people who aren't being heard or people who aren't being respected. And therefore, one of the most important forms of storytelling is just sitting down around a table and sharing your stories. And first, sharing your stories with the people in the same minority community in order to connect to them more, but also to share stories in order to build bridges to other minority communities. Because we're all a part of a minority in one way or another. That just depends how you slice the pie. And stories allow curiosity to be a two-way street. Sharing stories means that we can sit down with the people who may have labeled us or who may be enforcing these labels onto us and ask them why they feel this way. And that will hopefully promote some sort of mutual understanding and tolerance. Because we're stronger together, even if the stories that we have to tell to get to that stronger point feel scary to share. So by reflecting on the death of my father and my brothers, I think I've come to do something a lot of people maybe thought I wouldn't do. I think if you asked my mum or my teachers or anybody who knew me when I was younger if I would ever be able to use my sensitivity to stand on a stage like this and speak in front of so many people about such a subject, they would have said no. But I did. And I consider that a great personal step towards coming to terms with this sensitivity label and what that means to me. And to prove to people that yes, I was sensitive, yes, I am still sensitive, and at this point that sensitivity is something I pride myself on because it allows me to understand other people better. I am not as weak as some thought I were. So we need to keep telling the stories of the difficulties that minorities face in order to prove to society that just because they've shoved it into certain boxes and set us aside, we can still do all the things that they think we can't. So we need stories. We need them in order to correct the record and to erase misconceptions. But most importantly, we need stories in order to spread hope.